Thank you, Peter, for that very kind introduction. And Bob and I are delighted to be back here for a third time to participate in this conference. And we have the third in the three conceptual papers that we had envisioned in this series on e-ledger accounting, now ready. This paper was published in the July issue of Harvard Business Review, and it's called Disclosing Downstream Emissions. And we are delighted to be able to share these insights with the audience in this conference as we have for the last couple of years. So this paper was published in the July 2024 issue of the Harvard Business Review. And what we'd like to do is give you a quick overview of the key arguments in the paper. As the title of the paper suggests, Disclosing Downstream Emissions, what we're doing in this paper is setting up a disclosure framework for when companies are accountable for emissions incurred downstream from their operations. For those of our readers who are already familiar with the e-liability approach and the e-asset approach, they know that these are accounting approaches as opposed to disclosure approaches. So one of the things that makes this paper distinctive from our prior two papers is that it is a disclosure solution rather than an accounting solution. The second thing that makes it distinctive is its focus on downstream rather than on incurred emissions activities or incurred removal activities, which were the focus of our first two papers. So in a nutshell, this paper is focusing on the disclosure of downstream emissions by entities, and in particular lays out some principles for when entities would be accountable for emissions downstream. Part of our point is that it is not a universal accountability. That is to say that not all entities are accountable for downstream emissions all of the time, as would be the case under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Scope 3 framework. But rather, downstream accountability is a very limited and special case, and we will articulate what those limited and special cases are, as well as why those are the limited and special cases where downstream accountability applies. And we will spend a little bit of time also thinking about the issue of fossil fuel emissions, because fossil fuel emissions are of particular salience, and the accountability of fossil fuel companies for those emissions are of particular salience to environmental advocates. So we'll spend some time on that issue as well. And time permitting, toward the end, we'd like to give you a little update on the e-liability project. Many of you have been in touch with us over the course of the last couple of years and are part of the e-Liability Institute's wider stakeholder network. So we'd like to take this opportunity to give you an update on all the various things that we're up to at the e-Liability Institute. So that will give us a quick overview of the time we're going to spend together in this session. And Bob, I thought I would turn it to you and ask a question that we've been often asked on this paper, Disclosing Downstream Emissions, which is, why did we not initially include downstream reporting in our framework, and why are we doing so now?
Well, thank you, Karthik. There actually are several reasons for the separation of downstream emissions from that articulated in our current paper from our original paper in November 2021, Accounting for Climate Change, where we just addressed upstream or supply chain emissions, technically known as cradle to gate. The first reason that we focus only on cradle to gate, the supply chain emissions, is that there was a very simple solution to those emissions, which is different from the way they were being treated in Scope 3 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Instead of a focus on a downstream company attempting to measure and calculate all the upstream emissions, which is, as we talked about in that first paper, a virtually impossible task. We said, no, if you just stand in a different place, start at the beginning and aggregate emissions as they occur, moving it from supplier to customer at each stage of the value chain, we can use basic accounting principles, inventory accounting, a little cost accounting of allocating within the firm, and let the output products and services that each company was producing carry that embedded carbon emissions to its immediate customers who could then use it. downstream emissions pose a very different kind of issue. First of all, there was, for many companies, it's also an impossible calculation. The idea that a farm or a plantation growing an agricultural product could somehow measure all the emissions associated with its processing, eventually ending up at a consumer heating up the product to eat it, was just seemed in the realm of science fiction. Not only could they not measure it, it would be completely out of their control about all the emissions that happened to the product once it left its own entity. So we thought, let's just put that aside. That upstream emissions, unlike what I just described, are actually controllable. Company can control the emissions in its supply chain through decisions it makes about the design of its products, the sourcing of its products, and the logistics arrangements it makes for transporting the inputs to its own processing plants. So we did that, and that was the solution, the liability solution, and we've been working on that for the next 3 years, and we'll continue. But people kept complaining, well, gee, the e-liability method only addresses upstream emissions. What about these downstream emissions? Don't you think they're important? So we thought, well, okay, let's see what's going on. What's the persistence here that causes people to keep coming back to it? And that led us to this paper, where we did actually find the kernel of truth, where some disclosure of downstream emissions is relevant, and actually that companies have some influence over how many downstream emissions are associated with that, which we will articulate subsequently in this talk. But those who are listening carefully will notice that when we talked about upstream emissions, we use the words accounting, e-liability accounting. And every time Karthik and I talk about downstream emissions, we use the word disclosure, explicitly not talking about accounting. So Karthik, maybe you want to articulate why we think this is an important distinction here.
That's right. And for those of you in the audience who are familiar with accounting research, the distinction between accounting and disclosure, particularly in the financial reporting context, is well known. And we think that distinction is really meaningful in this context as well. So accounting, for those who are less familiar with it, is a body of knowledge that focuses on accountability for entities, but it has very specific properties. For instance, accounting information is comparable cross-sectionally, that is, across entities. It is consistent over time, so you can compare an entity in one period with its performance in another period. It is representationally faithful, which is to say that the information that is presented in an accounting statement is seen as being within a non-material margin of error of the underlying economic truth. It is accurate and verifiable to a reasonableness standard, which is a very high threshold of assurance, as opposed to disclosure, which could be something that is only assured up to a limited scope standard. And importantly, for our purposes here, the accounting information is something that is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. That is to say, accounting information of different entities that are at arm's length with each other do not count the same profit twice. And when you add up the profits of all of these mutually exclusive entities, you get the collective performance of the jurisdiction in which those entities are operating. This is not the case with disclosure. And
one of the properties on the phenomenon that causes this separation or distinction between accounting and disclosure, and perhaps I should have mentioned that before, is in the supply chain emissions. The emissions have already occurred.
That's right.
It's a historical event. And accounting is about recording and just measuring and on the events that have already occurred. And that leads to the properties that Karthik just described, verifiability and auditability and measurability. Whereas the downstream emissions are very subjective and have yet to occur. And so we can't do accounting on events that have not occurred. I think that's right. The way it takes us into the role for disclosure.
That's right. And that's what makes this distinction important. But it's also then, as readers encounter the ideas that we present, they will notice that there will be an element of, in some sense, multiple counting, because the disclosure of downstream emissions will be such that multiple entities will be disclosing the same information. So it won't have the same sort of rigor that the accounting information that has been presented in our first two papers will have. But therefore, we think that this disclosure should be limited to some special cases, which we're going to talk about imminently. But that's really part of the distinction between accounting and disclosure that is very salient here. So just to summarize where we are right now, part of why we have not addressed this problem through accounting is because the problem of downstream is a problem of prospective emissions, and accounting does not lend itself to prospective emissions. And we don't want to address the problem of incurred emissions using disclosure for all of the reasons that we've already talked about. We want to bring the rigor of accounting to them. So we think that for the upstream part of the entity's performance, accounting is the right solution. And now for the downstream part of the entity's performance in these limited cases, disclosure is the right performance. And to summarize what we'd said earlier, there's a problem associated with the knowability of what's going to happen downstream. There's the information problem. There's the problem associated with the control of what's going to happen downstream, because companies can't control what is happening with their customers or how their customers' customers are going to use their products and so forth. And then there's this problem of diffuse accountability, because multiple entities are going to be handling the same pieces of information. And I think we have to keep all of these three problems, the information problem, the control problem, and the diffuse accountability problem, in mind as you think about these principles for downstream disclosure that we will introduce now. So in the paper, we introduce three principles for downstream disclosure. And we say when these three principles are met, or these are the three principles under which an entity should be accountable for what happens downstream and for the content of what it reports. And the first and most fundamental of these principles is the idea that downstream disclosure or downstream accountability is only sort of necessitated in the case of B2C transactions, that is to say, business to consumer transactions. If you are a B2B operation that is selling from one business to the next in a value chain, then there's no downstream accountability that's necessitated. And the reason, of course, is because your customer, which is also an entity, is going to account for those emissions in their e-ledgers. Whereas if you are selling directly to consumers, then it's unlikely that those consumers are going to produce e-ledgers. In theory, one could imagine a world in which all consumers produce e-ledgers as well, in which case this kind of downstream disclosure would not be necessitated. But as a practical matter, it seems unlikely that the 8 billion people in the world are going to start producing e-ledgers. Most of them don't even produce financial ledgers, so why would they produce e-ledgers? So it is the sale of or the transactions with end consumers that generates that first principle of accountability for downstream emissions. The second principle for sorry, go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So just so we alternate here for sharing the articulation. The second one is not, so just to summarize what the first principle that Karthik just articulated is there's no need for a company to report on downstream emissions if their product is being used and incorporated in some other company's production process, because it'll be measured there. Or, whatever that company's direct emissions are using its supplier's product will be calculated there. And so there's no need to do it. There's a single point of accountability. It made the decision to design its product using this particular component, and whatever emissions it creates is its responsibility and its accountability. So it's only potentially B2C companies, because of the fact that we can't expect 8 billion people in the world to do their own e-ledger accounting, that we have to think about the downstream emissions. But not all B2C companies. So, when I wear a shirt that a company produced, I'm not producing any emissions. And when I'm using my watch, solar powered, it works, and I'm not producing any emissions when I'm using the watch. So even though a company is selling me a watch or a shirt or a book that I'm reading, because I, as a consumer, are not producing emissions with it, then there's no need for them to report because there's nothing to report. So the second principle is that only companies that are producing products that when the consumers use them, they create emissions, should have this disclosure requirement. And so that could include automobile companies, because when I'm using the automobile, I'm combusting gasoline. It might include the fossil fuel company, because I'm using their product as well when I'm driving the car. And therefore, they should have some accountability for the emissions that I'm producing. And if a food company has produced a product that I have to heat up in a stove or a microwave, and there's some fossil fuel or emissions associated with the electricity or propane or that I'm using, then there is a downstream accountability for heating up the food, or if I'm having to use a detergent to wash clothes, that's also consuming electricity in the washing machine. All right, so the second principle is only B2C companies that are producing a product that consumers create emissions in their use of the product. And then the question is, which companies? Now, for an automobile, there's a dealer. I go to the new car dealer to buy the car, and in principle, I'm their customer, and I'm going to be burning gasoline or consuming electricity in the driving the car. Well, the dealer has really no control over that. The amount of emissions that I'm creating when I use the automobile is really baked into the design and production decisions of the automobile company, Toyota or BMW or Ford. And if I'm heating up some food and consuming energy, creating emissions when I heat up the food, again, it's not the retailer, Wegmans or Walmart or Carrefour's, that actually influenced how much emissions I create when I'm heating up the food. It's really the food company. And so the second principle is say, it's the companies basically whose name is on the product. Generally, I know, with the name of the car I'm buying and the name of the consumer packaged good company that sold me the food package that I have to heat up. They have the accountability because they're the ones who designed the product and determined what its fuel economy is or how long I have to heat it up in order to use the product. So it's a very restricted set of companies that do have this accountability because of their decisions that they made about which products to produce and the design of the products and the amount of emissions produced in the consumer's use of those products.
That's right.
The principle three is
just to summarize, Bob, on that. I think there are two important things that we should just highlight that are implicit in what you've said. First is this idea that for B2C companies whose products involve consumer energy use, those are the companies we want to zone in on. And there is a reasonable causal link. That's the formal language we use in the paper. There's a reasonable causal link between the production decisions of the B2C company and the consumer's energy use when operating the product. So like a washing machine or a car and so forth. So those are the two principles that articulate basically when a B2C company, so not all B2C companies, but when a B2C company is accountable for disclosing downstream emissions. Now, there are some important nuances that these first two principles raise, and it's worth clarifying because of how they contrast with the current greenhouse gas protocol approach. So, for instance, when you are a consumer riding in a bus or a passenger flying in a plane, then there's no accountability for downstream emissions there because the consumer's use of the product there, which is riding in the bus or flying the plane, does not entail any kind of emissions. The emissions are already incurred by the company, in that case, the bus company or the plane company that's flying the plane or riding the bus or operating the bus. Likewise, when you purchase electricity for use in your home, then the electricity supplier does not have to report downstream emissions because the consumer's use of that electricity does not in itself generate any new emissions. So these two principles are really important to articulate. It's true in the case of, say, for instance, the laundry detergent example that Bob just alluded to, or in the case of the automobile example that Bob alluded to, that we would have a disclosure of downstream emissions. But with a lot of these companies that are currently being asked to report so-called Scope 3 emissions, like automobile company, like the bus operators or the plane operators, or even the electricity utilities, the implications of these principles, these two principles we've already outlined, is that there's no downstream emissions that are necessitated. And that then takes
Yeah.
us to the third principle, Bob, that you were starting with.
Sure. But again, just a final point on Karthik's two corollaries to principle two is that it's not like the emissions in the bus company or the plane are lost. That's part of their reporting. That's part of their e-ledger reporting, based because they're the ones who are creating the emissions and they would be reporting on them. Okay, so now the third principle is, okay, now we've identified the limited set of companies who do have some downstream disclosure accountability. And the question is, what is it they should be disclosing? Now, staying with the automobile, that the automobile company, through its design decisions, has determined the fuel economy in the case of internal combustion engines, or the electricity consumption per kilometer driven for electric vehicles. But they have no control over how many kilometers the consumer drives. And so some consumers like me who just use it occasionally to commute to work, I'm driving 3,000 to 5,000 miles a year, while others might be driving 100,000 miles a year. And obviously, the downstream emissions associated with the road warriors driving 100,000 miles a year are very different than the Bob Kaplan commuting to work occasionally type of emissions. So if you think about the basic equation in cost accounting, which is the cost, of an input that you're using in your product, is the quantity of that input times the price per unit of the input. And it's you multiply those two together to get the total cost of that input. And you think about that same equation for carbon, the total carbon emissions by a consumer is the quantity of use of that product times the emissions per unit of the use. And the companies with downstream emissions accountability affect the second term, but not the first term. Okay, so they're affecting the rate that emissions are occurring per unit of consumer use, which could be per kilometer driven or per minute of cooking time. So the company might say, well, boil this for 10 minutes, but the consumer actually decides to boil it for 20 minutes because they like it really well done. So that's under the control of the consumer, but not under the control of the company. So we argue in this third principle that companies report on the emissions per unit of use by the consumer, but not have to try to come up with some estimate of the total emissions because of the heterogeneity of the consumer's use and also the lack of controllability. They really don't have control over the quantity of use that is required.
That's right.
And so we're limited to that rate of emissions per unit of use.
That's right. And I thought maybe it would be helpful.
Those are the three principles.
Yes, those are basically the three principles. Number one, just to recap, that it's just B2C companies. Number two, that it's not all B2C companies, it's B2C companies where there's a reasonable causal link between the production decisions of the company and the energy use by the consumer when using the product. And number three, that you're not reporting on the total emissions at the consumer stage, you're reporting on the rate of emissions use per incidence, because of course the total emissions is also a product of consumer decisions, and we want to make sure that we're not sort of implicating the company in that. So those give you the three broad principles for disclosure. And what I thought I would do is just use those three principles to walk us through the special case of fossil fuels. because fossil
No,
fuel
so before we do
companies.
that, Karthik,
Yeah,
I realized Karthik, yeah,
yeah, sure.
I forgot.
Go
I
ahead.
left out an example just to illustrate the three principles. So let me do
Yeah,
the tire company story,
sure,
and then we'll
sure.
turn to fossil fuels. So a really good example of the application of these three principles is the first company that we worked with on e-liability accounting, which was an international tire company based in Indonesia. And the tires that they produce, the emissions associated with the tires they produce and sell, first is their own emissions to produce the tire. But if they're selling to a OEM company, Toyota or BMW, then they don't have to report on Toyota or BMW's emissions, in somehow mounting the tire on the vehicle. That whatever emissions the downstream OEM company produces, they'll measure that and they'll report that. So the only downstream emissions that the tire company has is if when they sell directly to consumers. So they have another line of business of selling replacement tires. So now when they're selling replacement tires through tire dealers or big box stores, now the consumers are buying their tire directly. Now we have the downstream accountability for the, the rate of emissions that's really influenced by the design and construction of the tire. And so if they can produce a tire with much lower rolling friction, then the consumers will get better gasoline miles, and they can get credit for that, of producing a tire with lower rolling friction, therefore is generating fewer emissions in the use of that product. And so there's an example of a company, the B2B business selling to OEMs, no disclosure requirement. It's only its second line of business selling directly to consumers, where they would be reporting on the rate of emissions per kilometer driven based on the rolling friction and the design of the tire.
That's right. And
Now,
and that
but staying with automobiles, that would lead us to another use of or generation of emissions, which is due to the burning of gasoline or the use of electricity in driving the car. And the one comment that people raised to Karthik and me after our first paper is, we love the liability accounting, makes a lot of sense, but aren't you letting the fossil fuel companies off the hook? And we kept hearing this. And we're going, geez, I don't know. We're measuring all their emissions just like we're measuring the emissions of all the other companies. But there was something that kept persisting, and that's kind of what motivated us to pay attention to this paper. And Karthik, I know, just got back from Guyana, where there was a major discovery of hydrocarbons. And so you were hanging out with a bunch of fossil fuel companies for a few days. So how does this downstream emissions principles apply to them?
Yeah, that's right. So Guyana, as you mentioned, is a fascinating country that in the last 5 years has been growing at something over 30 or 40% GDP per year. So a part of the growth is driven by the discovery of a massive offshore fossil fuel facility. And you can imagine that in the course of just the last few years, the country has gone from being a lower middle income country to being one of the top 10 richest countries in the world by GDP per capita. And part of the challenge that the government is facing is how to distribute all this newfound wealth equitably, which is part of the reason I was there. But this comes back to this really important question of how do we hold the fossil fuel companies accountable for what's happening as a result of their actions? Now, let's take the three principles that we've articulated for downstream emissions and let's apply them to the case of fossil fuels. So if you're a fossil fuel company, for instance, selling your product, say gasoline, to a company that is operating an airline or to a company that's operating a fleet of buses, then of course that company is then going to take full charge and full accountability of your inventory and therefore of the emissions to be incurred when they combust that inventory to produce energy. So the fossil fuel company, in selling to B2B businesses, we would argue, does not have to account for downstream emissions. So that's consistent with our first principle. Now, in some cases, the fossil fuel company is selling to end consumers. When you go buy gasoline directly at the gas station, you can say, well, it's the gas station that's selling it to me. But the gas station is playing the role of the supermarket in the example that Bob was giving earlier. It's just simply a retail intermediary. The identity, the company that whose decision has a direct impact on your combustions is the fossil fuel company that supplies to the gas station. So we want to go back to the fossil fuel company rather than the gas station and say, what is the accountability per our second principle for that fossil fuel company for the incurred emissions at the consumer stage? Right. And so it's in the context of those direct B2C sales for when the consumer is using their automobile for personal use or when they are heating their home using fossil fuels, direct combustion of fossil fuels. For personal use, that the company, the fossil fuel company, has to take some accountability for the disclosure of downstream emissions. But per the third principle, they're not accountable for the volume of the emissions in the so the total volume of the fuel burn, because as Bob mentioned earlier, you can have customers that are sort of road warriors that are driving, considerably more than other customers, and that's a personal decision whether you decide, to go on a long road trip cross country, or whether you decide, as is the case in me, I don't own a car. I just rent a car when I need one because I don't need it. I live 50 feet away from where I work, so I can just commute by on foot. And so that kind of decision is, of course, up to the individual consumer. We don't want companies to be making those decisions on the basis of for consumers. That would be a very unfree society, and we don't want to live in such a society. So we say that ultimately the fossil fuel company is responsible for B2C sales of its fossil fuels, but of the carbon emission factors associated with those fuels sold, as opposed to the total volume of the fuel sold, which is a consumer-led decision. So that means that fossil fuel companies aren't wholly off the hook under this framework, but they're certainly not the, we don't want to paint the picture of them being sort of the unmitigated evil here, because of course there is responsibility across the board that needs to be held for emissions associated from fossil fuels. Now we've got the 10-minute warning, and one of the things that Peter was very keen for us to discuss, Bob, is updates on the e-liability project. The participants in this ASWQ conference have been following the e-liability project for 3 years now. They've seen us grow from a single paper with just a compelling idea to now a not-for-profit that has run dozens of pilots with Fortune 500 companies, some very large governments and not-for-profits, including the NHS here in the UK. And we've had a burst of activity, both in the pilot space as well as in the regulatory standard setting space. So I thought maybe we can give a quick update on these two elements. And maybe we'll start with the pilots, Bob, if you can just lead us through some of the interesting pilots that you've been working on, and then I can come in on my end, and then we'll talk about some regulatory updates as well.
Yeah. So our initial batch of pilots, and these are documented in articles in Harvard Business Review, digital online edition, we're really focused on individual companies. We did the tire company, we did a cement company, and we went around and we saw how the e-liability method looked for them. Increasingly, in the last 6 to 12 months and continuing in the future, we're really looking for supply chain systems and looking about how we measure across a whole supply chain. And Karthik really did the first one of these, which was we talked about at last year's conference about copper and tracing the mining of copper all the way into electrical transformers of Hitachi Energy. And, that went through 4 stages. And we found that fascinating result that virgin copper mines in a very efficient mine in northern Sweden had far lower emissions than copper that was being recycled by incinerating printed circuit boards. And the beauty of the e-ledger accounting is to be able to do these complex supply chains and trace emissions accurately. And so we're now doing more in agriculture, because agriculture has extensive supply chains. One we're working is with dairy industry in the United States, and this starts with cows on farms, and that's a big source of both CO2, but especially CH4, methane emissions, and tracing it through farm milk and then how it gets processed into other, cream and yogurt and cheese products, and eventually getting to supermarket shelves. So we're trying to really go stage by stage from farm to shelf to look at the emissions and how do we track, low carbon emitting farms that really are reducing methane, reducing the CO2 production, and show how that benefits the downstream customers. We're looking in agriculture from soybean production in South America and growing soybeans and then tracing it into final products. A particularly fascinating one is potentially low carbon beef, where instead of having to deforest the Amazon to create grazing land for cattle, there's a type of beef that actually likes feeding on the vines that otherwise would kill trees in the forest. So they're actually contributing to more carbon sequestration by making the trees healthier in the Amazon and feeding off the vines that otherwise are choking and limiting the growth of these trees. And those downstream customers using the beef from that cattle actually are getting much lower carbon beef. So we're very excited about that. Moving away from agriculture, there's groups in Europe that we're starting to work with, which are really tracing the supply chain for steel and plastic components in the automotive industry. So these are two very high carbon production processes. You go from the minerals or the hydrocarbons that go into steel and plastic and through the processing and eventually end up in an automobile. And we're going to be tracing the actual emissions as they move from stage to stage. So that's what's happening in the pilot projects. We're still doing point solutions with individual companies. Very large producer of solar cells in China. It's a current plant, and so electricity is not zero. Electricity from the sun is not zero carbon energy. There's a lot of emissions associated with the mining of the minerals that go into the solar cells and the production and assembly of those solar cells, and that has to be allocated out to the electricity production. So, Karthik,
That's right.
But you're going into the next stage of e-ledger accounting. So why don't you use our remaining time to talk about the standard settings that you're working on?
That's right. Yeah. So these pilots that Bob just mentioned, together with some other pilots we've done in the services sector, including in healthcare sector, we've even run a pilot in Afghanistan, with a small services business. And part of the reason we did that, although people say, well, what's the real demand for carbon accounting in Afghanistan, is to show how easy it is to collect primary data if you really have the right will. Even if you're a small business in Afghanistan, you can collect primary data, because we get this pushback sometimes from companies saying, and large companies that shouldn't have trouble collecting primary data, saying, but I can't collect primary data. So we wanted to show, well, if a small business in Afghanistan can collect primary data, then I'm sure you can. So these pilots are helping us demonstrate proof of concept. We're also initiating a series of pilots on the e-asset side, which is to say on the carbon removal side. As you know, as you, as in the readers and the author, the participants in the SW conference know, we think that avoidance offsets are not offsets. Only removal offsets are offsets. And we want to articulate what are the principles under which removal offsets can be, in fact, classified as assets, which are nettable against e-liability. So we're doing a series of pilots in that space involving basically nature-based offsets, direct air capture, which is to say mineralization, but also open systems strategies for offsetting. These are the kinds of offsets that involve basically the use of things like ocean absorption for the offsetting process. So we're running offsets in this space. We're running pilots in these offset spaces as well. And part of the reason for this expansive program of offsetting pilots and pilots in the e-liability space is, as Bob mentioned, we are under increasing encouragement from various players in the regulatory space to convert our academic ideas on e-liability and e-assets into proto standards. So I'm also leading a project with our excellent staff at the Liability Institute to take this knowledge that we have in conceptual form and turn it into proto standards, turn it into something that looks like a standard for e-liability or e-ledger accounting. And we have an excellent technical working group of about 40 to 50 individuals coming from a number of blue chip companies, also some regulators, some central banks, some not for profits, who are advising us on the practical implementation guidance associated with putting these standards out there. These standards will all be in the public domain. I'm happy to report that the first version of the standards has already been circulated to our technical working group in the summer now of 2024. And by the end of the summer of 2024, when you're seeing this, we hope that these standards will already be in the public domain. And what we're going to do is make these standards available as a global public good for free for any jurisdiction or any entity or any assurance provider to use as they see fit, under no copyright or any kind of licensing requirement, because we want countries, as they're thinking about carbon accounting regulations, particularly in the context of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which have become increasingly popular in EU and US. We want these jurisdictions to be able to use a common and consistent and rigorous basis of carbon accounting for their legislation and regulation. So these standards will be put in the public domain very shortly. And as with everything else that we do, it will be available for free on e-liability.institute, which is our website. So e-liability.institute is where you can get the standards when they're available, but also the results of all of these various pilot studies that we've discussed with you. I believe we're at time. So again, a huge, huge thank you to Peter and to the entire editorial crew, Lori, and all of the editors at the journal, as well as to the production team for hosting us now for a third year in a row. And we look forward to all of you, your feedback on our work. We look forward to your engagement with our work. If you want to get involved in any of the work that we're doing, please email us at info@e-liability.institute. Bob, a final word from you.
No, I think you said it very well. We're pleased to have these annual updates, and we have some ideas still in the pipeline for further writing, and maybe Peter and Laurie will invite us to give us a talk a year from now on what's new, as well as the summary and update of what has gone on based on our previous articles.